So two people were put through a risk assessment algorithm that would judge how likely they were to commit a crime in the future on a scale from 1 to 10. 1 being least likely, 10 being most likely. Vernon Prater, a 41-year-old white man, had 3 previous convictions, 2 for armed robbery, 1 for attempted armed robbery, but he received a risk of 3. Brescia Borden, an 18-year-old African-American woman, had 4 previous juvenile misdemeanors, but she received a risk of 8. More than twice the rating of Vernon Prater. Now, according to the article Machine Bias, published in 2016 by ProPublica, Vernon Prater went on to commit a grand theft after receiving his assessment, and Brescia Borden did not commit any crimes afterwards. So, you may be thinking, what was this assessment? Who programmed it, and why was it so biased? Well, what if I told you this was a product of artificial intelligence? And not only do we not actually know who programmed it, but we don't really know how it works. So, artificial intelligence, or AI for short, is an incredible technology that people are using to create machines that are able to function independent from humans. Today, I want to give you guys a brief explanation of how this works, and then explain some of the cautions we have to take when implementing it in our society and how it might go wrong. Now, first of all, artificial intelligence isn't something that's necessarily programmed like a video game or a website is. Instead, it learns how to function by going through a process called deep learning. So, in deep learning, the computer starts with a map of neurons that correspond to small elements of a larger concept. Each neuron is given a a random weight that corresponds to how important it is in determining the final output. Programmers are then able to teach the computer by giving it a series of pre-categorized examples that it then can sift through in order to find common patterns and help it get to the output. And while it's doing so, the computer adjusts the weight of each neuron so that eventually it can take the same inputs as the examples and produce the same outputs. Now, the thing is, computer programmers don't necessarily know how this works because it's too complicated to show through code. They just know that it's happening. And in the 2017 article in Scientific American by Aaron Hintz, he points out that as AI designs get even more complex and computer processors even faster, their skills will improve, which will lead us to give them more responsibility even as the risk of unintended consequences arise. And so we can't deny the usefulness and life-saving applications of artificial intelligence, but if we don't know exactly how they function, how can we be sure that they're doing what we expect? So one example of AI doing some very good things is Deep Patient, which is a program created by doctors at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York that's able to take patient symptoms and medical history and use its algorithms to diagnose illnesses. This has been used to diagnose symptoms predicting the onset of schizophrenia, which is notoriously really hard to determine. It's also being used by government organizations. For example, the NOVA, No Violence Alliance in Kansas City, that's another risk assessment like the one I previously mentioned. It uses factors like criminal records, gang connections, and social circles to identify people's likelihood of committing a crime in the future. And police officers will often take a list of these people and use that as like a guide to go off of who to look for. And while this can be good, it also means that sometimes policemen and judges are very quick to arrest or imprison someone on fairly low charges. And according to a 2015 article in the New York Times by John Ellington and Timothy Williams, judges once used this risk assessment to give a man a 15-year prison sentence for being caught with a bullet in his pocket, and another man a 25-year prison sentence for having recreational designer drugs and posting a photograph with a gun on Facebook. So while we know a few of the factors used to make these assessments, the public and even the government doesn't actually know how much weight the algorithm puts on each of these individual factors, and furthermore doesn't quite know what else the computer is considering when it's making these decisions. In 2016, the nonprofit journal ProPublica came out with an analysis on the COMPAS redivision algorithm, which is another risk assessment, where they conducted research that compared defendants' predicted risk ratings with their actual criminal record over a 2-year span after they received the assessment. Now, the study found that black defendants were far more likely than white defendants to be given a wrongly judged to be at a higher risk, versus white defendants were far more likely to be wrongly judged to be at a lower risk. Now, this suggests that computers are learning biases, like racial biases, through their data analysis. And we can kind of imagine how that could be true, because computers are using past data from past criminal arrests for their algorithms and are going to take into account the biases and inequalities already established. And these computers don't really have a way of determining which arrests were created using biases that, like, police officers may not have even known about. And so they don't really have a way to filter out which ones are right and wrong. And according to a 2011 article by Loyola Law professor Bill Quigley in his writing about examples of racism in the criminal justice system, there is a 85% chance that police will stop and frisk African Americans and Latinos versus an only 8% chance for whites. And he further cited data that found that African Americans, who are 13% of the population and 14% of drug users, are actually 37% of the people arrested for drugs and 56% of the people in state prisons for drug offenses. And so if computers are taking this information and using that in their algorithms, it's going to end up causing these faulty assessments will result in criminals going free, judges convicting innocent people, and in general the American criminal justice system targeting more people of color. Now, as I mentioned with Deep Patient, AI can be put to very good use, but it can also be misused if we trust it blindly without really knowing what's going on. So what I think is that the best thing we can do right now is to learn as much as we can. We can't totally understand how these algorithms are working, but if we try to get to the core of the issue, we can go from there. Another thing to consider is that oftentimes government regulation comes as a response to something bad happening, but only once a community detects a problem, they're going to create regulations to prevent it in the future. But AI is advancing so exponentially fast that that's not going to be an effective thing to do, because the more information we gain from it, the wider the range of possibilities become, and the more power we're giving it. And so now that I've explained to you a little bit about how AI works and some of the ways it's being implemented, I hope you can see how we need to be taking careful steps forwards instead of blind leaps of faith, because technology in the future has the ability to do both good and bad, but the final outcome will rely on how we handle the present. Thank you.